Welcome to part 5 of climate action. Part 5 covers mitigation strategies. Okay, so in this part, we will be looking at several different forms of mitigation strategies that has been adopted, both in the two main wings, one in terms of how we try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and of course, the other wing of mitigation strategies will be looking at enhancing carbon sinks. So this section here will be a little bit bigger. We will be looking at the first section, which entails reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We will be focusing on the four main ways that we can actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So take a look at this. This is a typical area where you have factors, comparable factors, right? So think about what that could lead to in terms of implications for questioning types and assessments. So when we're looking at effectiveness of mitigation challenges, right, you always have to keep in mind that there are certain types of challenge that will limit the effectiveness of your mitigation strategies. So first, of course, is always going to be technology, right? There are factors that technological factors that can actually increase, or due to the lack of access to these factors, decrease the effectiveness. Okay, similarly, economic is another one. How developed the country is, how economically viable these strategies are to be applied to this area. Social factors include things like educational options, because let's put it this way: if I have a very good idea about how to educate people to pivot away from using carbon ineffective energy sources to one that is more carbon neutral, but there is no venue to spread this out in terms of an educational institution and all, then these are all going to be a problem. So let's take a look about the strategies that seek to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, the first one we'll look at very quickly would be the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework for Convention on Climate Change. So this is the Rio Convention, the Earth Summit, which was originally held in 1992. Right, so what was it actually in 1992? Well, it's a long time ago for you, but it's within my consciousness as a teenager back then, right? So what was the objective of that? Okay, it was trying to prevent irreversible anthropogenic impacts. Now, what does what anthropogenic means? It means man-made. So it's a key geographical term. If you are going to be talking about man-made impacts moving forward, please remember you have to use key geographical terms, one of which will be anthropogenic. Next thing it was trying to do was to provide sufficient time for ecosystem to adapt naturally to the climate change that was happening. Okay, so at this point, scientists were already very clear that climate change was real. Okay, this is 1992. This is way before Donald Trump had started coming out with all the fake news about climate change. So, a couple of things to deal with this. So when they came together, then they had the discussion at the Earth Summit, right? One thing was very clear. The world is still very uneven. You still have a group of countries that are called DCs, developed countries, okay, or the developed industrialized countries, and then you have the LDCs who are much further down the development scale. As a result, they may have more natural resources, but they are not as economically viable. Their infrastructure is definitely not there, and they are seeking to become like DCs. So who then has more responsibility, right? So in the discussion, one of the outcomes that came out was that the DC should have more responsibility. They should lead the way towards climate sustainability. Okay, because number one, they are the ones who, if you think about it very carefully, who use old tech to get to where they are, and they are the ones who created this baseline amount of pollution, right? So while they are already at the developed state, it is only right that they come forward and they take more responsibility. So what kind of responsibility and how can they help, right? Be it in technological support, or be it in terms of providing monetary support for who? For the LDCs. So when at the summit, one of the main ideas that came out was the DCs have to take more action. They have to lead the way. Because of where they are in terms of development, in terms of economic prowess and all, they should be providing the funds and the technologies for the LDCs, for the developing countries, so that developing countries do not continue to use these polluting methods to develop themselves, and as a result, do not worsen the problem. Okay, What about the LDCs? Is it just sitting there and just taking all this money and squandering it away? No. So the flip side, the LDCs or the developing countries who are then receiving all this help are then tasked with the monitoring and progress of climate change and to provide regular updates to the community itself so that they can track. Okay, what are they tracking? They're not only tracking whether the money has been abused and squandered away and lost to corruption, but they're also tracking whether DCs are doing their part as well. So this reporting is a two-way street. So everybody needs to play their role effectively, and everybody has to do their part. Who makes the decisions? Right, this is a conference of parties, COP. Right, so they come together and they sign the agreement, and the agreement was that they have to attend this regularly. Okay, so over the years they've held 25 meetings in different countries. Okay, so the moving on from that, the Paris Agreement is another one that the countries came up and agreed to. This is also the one that Trump actually revoked when he came into power. Okay, why? Because the Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty. Okay, so this was one of the very first ones that was legally binding. If you adopt it, you would have to follow the targets that you set. Now, look at the words in blue. The targets are set by the countries themselves. So, while it is a legally binding agreement and a treaty, the targets were set by the countries themselves so as to give them an allowance in terms of you know where your country is, you know what your country can do sustainably and not hurt your own people. So, it was with this intent that if you take some action, it's better than not taking action. So, everybody could set their own targets, everybody was encouraged to do this. Okay, so these are the areas that the Paris Climate Agreement dealt with in terms of temperature, in terms of finance, in terms of burden sharing, emissions, differentiation. So who needs to do more, who needs to do less. There was a climate damage analysis and then review mechanism. So every 5 years they were supposed to come back and do a review. So keep this in mind. This was 2015. So every 5 years it would mean that the next meeting was 2020. Okay, 2020. Now, what are the limitations of this kind of international agreements? We've looked at two, right? Number one, institutional. Okay, implementation, it varies, and countries do have changes in leadership. And when you have changes in leadership and opinions and underlying beliefs, it is not impossible that countries that were in the agreement pull out of the agreement. Okay, so 2017 we did see with Donald Trump coming into power, he actually withdrew America from the Paris Agreement. Okay, actually, when you think about what he says, what he believes, or what he says he believes about the economy, it makes some logical sense. Because when I agree to certain the terms of the agreement in terms of reducing carbon emissions and all, what am I forcing my people to do? I'm forcing my people to take more carbon neutral, more sustainable options, which most of the time are not cheaper. So, in terms of from a money standpoint, this doesn't make sense, right? Why am I restricting my countries, well, companies in my countries, my people, from using the cheapest mode to earn the most money? Okay, these people won't vote for me if I keep doing this, right? So, as a way of self-preservation and staying in power, it is the institutional problem that these kind of agreements tend to encounter, right? Okay, next, a lot of these contributions are not legally binding. So it's not as if, okay, let's say Singapore has agreed to reduce 5 million tons of CO2 every year. Every year we want to decrease 5 million tons of emissions. Now, if this year we don't meet it, we don't get slapped with punishment. Nobody goes to jail. Nobody pays a fine. There's no legal action, right? So you do get looked upon in disdain by the other countries. That's it. But that's it. You can look at me with disdain for all you like. Doesn't hurt me. Okay, right. So moving on, we're going to look at the next wing, which is the low carbon technologies. Okay, what is the crux of using low carbon tech is to emit low levels of greenhouse gas. Okay, so by emitting lower levels, you will reduce the worsening of the impact. You will not remove the impact. Okay, keep this very clear. When you're using low carbon tech, you're still releasing carbon, but at a much lower level, so you're reducing the impact. Okay, How do you do this? You of course need to cover all sectors. Okay, all sectors. You cannot just say, oh, let's just deal with transportation. Let's just use electric cars, right? And continue to eat meat like nobody's business, and continue to use plastics like nobody's business. It's not going to work that way. So you need to cover all sectors. Okay. So how do you implement it in a national level? You have to have policies, laws, and systems. So I give you an idea of a policy change. So for example, the government has in the past few years come up with the policy that we should reduce plastic consumption. So what is the reaction from the community? It is things like now when you go to a supermarket, you are charged for a plastic bag. So it's to encourage people not to use plastic bags haphazardly, right? Or to think a bit more before you use such environmentally damaging items. Okay, so the first mode of low carbon tech that we will look at is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. This actually refers to, in terms of carbon capture, right, the process of separating and capturing carbon dioxide from all your emission locations. So when you're having a power plant, we're having a factory, industrial building, there is always going to be carbon dioxide release. So most in the past, this will definitely be just released into the atmosphere itself, and this will form a thicker layer of carbon dioxide, thicker layer of greenhouse gases, and lead to our climate change, okay, worsening all the time. So when you're looking at carbon capture, you're looking at finding a way to remove this carbon that is being emitted, right? You hold it in place and you release it into a safe location, right? So what is believed to be a safe location will be back deep in the ground, okay, pumped into the ground, or deep into the oceans itself, where it's not directly released straight into the atmosphere, and it doesn't immediately impact your climate change. Okay, utilization and storage. There are storage options. Deep ocean storage is one where it's dissolved, okay, or injected into deep water, so that it doesn't come immediately into exposure, right? Carbon utilization, right? Using carbon dioxide as a raw material to produce other things. With better technology, this recycling process of carbon dioxide is an option increasingly. Now, limitations, it is expensive. Okay, it's expensive. Technology is expensive in its initial stage, and we are in the initial stages of this. So, how much are we looking at in a small country like Singapore, with our small amount? Okay, I wouldn't say very small amount. With our kind of carbon emissions, right? You're looking at millions of dollars. Okay, so if you can imagine a larger country with more carbon emissions, you would be looking at billions of dollars. Are governments willing to spend this money then? Right? Governments have a few major concerns, and unfortunately, climate change has never been one of the big ones for most countries. Okay. Next, technological limitations. There's always a concern that there may be leakage when you do storage. So what happens when there's leakage? It just all goes back into the atmosphere. So all the money you spend, all the supposedly good benefits that you supposedly have when you adopt these things and you go up in flames. Next, when we are looking at using clean energy sources, right? The understanding has to be that traditionally we burn fossil fuel for energy, okay? And burning of fossil fuel accounts for 90% of carbon emissions globally, okay? But it also accounts for 80% of the world's energy, okay? So other energy forms include, besides your naturally sourced clean energy, things like nuclear energy is also able to produce energy, right? So when we're looking at renewable resources, it's at a rate where nature can replenish those resources. Okay, zero emissions is something that we all hope to eventually have, but it just means that the energy source does not pollute the atmosphere when it's being produced or when it's being used. So there are a few types. First one, we're going to look at solar. Solar is something that we mentioned earlier on in the video series, right? So basically you're harnessing energy from the sun, storing it so that you can use as electricity. Hydroelectricity, okay, so let me put a point across first. When you're looking at hydroelectricity and geothermal, right, the functionality that creates that electricity is the same thing. It's the turbine in the generator. Okay, so what is churning the turbine, which then in turn churns the generator, which in turn creates electricity, is dependent on what you're using. So in hydroelectricity, what we're using is moving water. So when you have a dam, right, when you create a dam, you are able to then channel water at high speed and pressure downstream. And that allows you to direct it at the turbine and cause the turbine to spin and then generate electricity in the way. So when we're looking at geothermal, right, it's actually also very similar. Okay, there's also a turbine, but what is moving the turbine and generator is now steam from underground. So you need to plug the steam, right, and direct it through the system so it turns the turbine, turns the generator, and then it generates electricity. So you look at these two diagrams, so they're actually very, very similar. The crux of it is really the turbine and the generator. Okay. Now, which one will a country choose to use? If you, of course, have access to geothermal energy, then geothermal is a great way to go. If not, if you have large amounts of water or water catchment, or you have a large enough reservoir that can be replenished constantly by nature, then hydroelectricity is a great way as well. Nuclear, right? Nuclear energy, one that is relatively um, low in terms of raw material consumption, but there are also risks involved. So I think within your lifetime, you may or may not have experienced when Fukushima, the reactor in Fukushima actually had a meltdown. Okay, but throughout humanity's history, right, we have had several nuclear disasters from Chernobyl to Fukushima to the one in America, which I cannot recall suddenly. Right, so this, although there are many, many benefits of nuclear energy, humans have tend to shy away from it unless there is no other choice because of the implications of nuclear meltdown. So in Singapore, what are our options? So once again, I want to bring you back to this video that you will also find in that we talked about earlier, and you should have watched in the playlist, right? What can we do? Can we do nuclear? What happens if we do nuclear and there's a nuclear incident? Right? Would the neighboring countries be willing to let us experiment with that? Right? So what are the implications of that? Do we have space for hydroelectric? Do we have geothermals below our surface area to do geothermal energy? Why is it that we end up doing solar farms? So what are our options? Okay, this is important. Right. So currently, with solar energy in Singapore, right, is it able to do replacement? Right. So think about it. Do you think we have enough space for solar? Is it cost efficient to turn to solar? Okay, right. I know some of you may be still thinking about ideas of solar power means what? Means if it's very cloudy today, we have no lights, no power, no fan, no aircon. No. Okay. So in all these energy, this new renewable energy sources, right? What we're looking at is storage. Okay, so they can generate and they can store. Okay, so it's not weather dependent. Right, limitations of using green energy economically is expensive, so keep this in mind. It is very expensive compared to what is tried and tested but very polluting. Okay, so environmental impact wise, okay, they may not be so suitable, right? We do have a lot of cloud cover and we do have enough storage, but the limitation, I think, with current tech is that it can only be a supplement. It cannot cover our total usage, even if we have solar panels everywhere. Okay, so the final one that we can look at is, of course, changes in consumption patterns, right? Things like what we own, what we eat, and what kind of waste we produce. So meat, okay, meat production contributes more greenhouse emissions than vegetables. So those of us who are more carnivorous than omnivorous, you actually do cause a greater impact on it. Okay, so when you look at land use change, right? Land use change, deforestation, you hit your emission, your carbon sink, right? When you are farming, right, use of machinery that hits. When you grow or rear livestock like cattle, which is very, very polluting, they produce a lot of methane, that's polluting again. But that doesn't end there, right? You don't go to the farm and take a bite out of the cow raw, okay? You have to have it processed, and in processing, there is use of machinery. So that further accentuates this problem. And after it's processed, the nice piece of sirloin or nice little piece of chicken breast that you want to eat it needs to get transported to where we buy it. So the transportation further accentuates it. Retail and packaging further accentuates it. The air conditioning you get in your CS Fresh, your NTUC, your whatever supermarket you go to, all these makes it worse. So this chain of food supply is also the negative chain of greenhouse gas emissions. So take a minute and think about in your life, right? The last meal you had before watching this video, where in the world did that meal come from? Where did the chicken come from? Where did the pork come from? Where did the broccoli come from? Was it grown in Singapore? Okay, what kind of land do you think was actually used to be converted into a farm that helped grow that piece of meat or that vegetable? Okay, how far did it travel? Do you know most of your broccoli comes from actually China or Australia? Okay, so keep that in mind and before we move on. Take a minute, think about it. So what can we do in consideration on reduction of food-based carbon emissions? First thing is shifting to a plant-based diet. It's not happening for me, but yeah, or more of a plant-based diet and less of a meat-based diet, because then you really reduce the amount of meat that needs to be produced. It reduces the intake of red meat. Okay, you will see a lot more complaints about red meat as you read more or you do a bit more research about meat and its polluting nature. But bear in mind that it is not just red meat. All forms of meat is going to be more polluting than vegetables. Okay, so if you're a vegetarian, congratulations, good for you. Right? The rest of us need to eat more vegetables and less meat. Okay, so there is a link for you to check your carbon footprint. Okay, there's a link for you to check your carbon footprint. I will post the link in your Teams chat, right? Buy local produce. Why? Because if you buy local produce, there's less transportation costs in terms of carbon release. So think about it, if the broccoli comes from Malaysia, right, it probably came by a truck. If the broccoli comes from China, you will have to go from where it was planted by truck to the processing plant. Then it needs to fly here, or it needs to come here on a boat, and then when it arrives in Singapore, it still needs to take a truck. So the amount of carbon that is produced is multifold. Next, reducing food waste. This is the other thing that we can do, because there is a lot of food waste from production to consumption end. So when you have food waste and it goes into a landfill, it produces greenhouse gases. Okay? Things like methane is constantly being produced when food rots away in landfills. Okay, contributing to climate change. So methane doesn't only come from the cow when the cow is alive, it also comes from the meats and the food that is wasted that goes into a landfill. Okay, so once again, food wastage can occur in any stage of the supply chain, right? And before it reaches the consumer, and it can also continue after it's reached the consumer, you. So think about the last meal once again, the last meal you had before this. Did you eat every single morsel of food that was on the plate served to you? What happens to those morsels that are not eaten? Okay, can they be recycled? Right? Is it composted? Okay, if not, where does it go? It goes and enters a landfill. In Singapore, it doesn't. It gets incinerated, which doesn't make it better. Okay, and this is why we need to reduce food waste. Okay? So if we look at who has the most food wastage carbon dioxide emissions, is normally the industrialized countries, the developed countries. Okay, doesn't mean that the developing countries are so much more carbon aware and all. They just have less food. Okay, they have less food, so they waste less food. Okay, in North America, Oceania, even in industrialized Asia, which includes Singapore, Japan, East Asia largely, right? We are the industrialized Asian countries, the ones who are deceased. We also have choices. So you think about the last time you went past the donut shop, it's scary, right? How much choice there is. Okay, so that also leads to food waste. Now, how effective are these mitigation strategies, right? When you think about it, it all comes down to two main ideas. One is your choices that we make 2 is the availability of these choices, and most importantly, 3 is the willingness of people living in developed areas or developed countries, right, in adopting a less convenient, more environmentally friendly lifestyle. Okay, because it's all got to do with convenience, right? Humans are lazy. You have to come to terms with that humans inherently are lazy, and we will definitely try to take the easiest way out. Okay, even if you're a hardworking person, yes, it happens. You will still try to do. It's a very unnatural thing to constantly look for the toughest, most serious way to do anything. Okay, so when we're looking at that, keep that in mind when looking at strategies. Okay, so the next video will deal with mitigation strategies using carbon sinks. Okay, using carbon sinks. So the first part we have done in this video is basically strategies using reduction in production of greenhouse gases, right? But now the next video we will be dealing with strategies by absorbing it, okay, absorbing this carbon, right? So hope to see you in the next video.